Tool by W F Harvey. Read by Richard Crowest. I like the long south corridor with its light-coloured walls and low windows looking onto the garden. I do my writing there, for it is very quiet, especially when Jellyby is off colour and is obliged to keep to his room. He calls himself a social democrat and is eloquent on the rights of man, a wonderfully fluent speaker with facts and figures at his fingertips to drive home every argument. But one tires of that sort of thing very easily. Of the two, I would rather listen to Charlie Lovell recite his endless pedigree as he sits dribbling over his knitting. I cannot help smiling to myself when I think of yesterday's sermon. Canon Eldred was the preacher, and he was obviously ill at ease, as indeed I should have been in similar circumstances. He has a red, cheerful face with comfortable folds of flesh about the chin, a typical healthy-minded Philistine whom it did one good to see. However, he was there to speak to us. He took as his theme the duty of cheerfulness. The subject was excellent, and what he said was to the point, but I could not help wondering whether he had the slightest idea of the condition of those whom he addressed. Evidently he realized our need, but there was a tendency to regard us less as men than as children. He spoke incautiously of the man in the street, and in so doing showed the falsity of his position. We have no use for arguments calculated to satisfy the ordinary man, since we are extraordinary men in an extraordinary position. No, the man in the street was, to say the least of it, a most unhappy phrase. I should like to tell Canon Eldred my own story. He told us that next week he was going away to enjoy a well-earned holiday. 2 years ago I was taking my summer holiday too. Autumn holiday it was, in fact, for our vicar. I was senior curate at the time in a big working-class parish in the north of England, had gone off to the sea with his children in July, and Legg, my junior, had claimed August for the Tyrol. I had made no definite plans for myself that year. Something, I felt sure, would turn up, and if all my friends were booked elsewhere, I knew that I could depend on 10 days at my uncle's place in Devonshire, or a fortnight of fresh air and plain living on Bob's disreputable old ketch. But somehow everything fell through. My uncle, who was beginning to be troubled about death duties, had let the shooting for the first time in 50 years. Bob was busy running his craft aground on Danish shoals, and I was left to my own resources. I set off, finally, at 12 hours' notice on a 10 days walking tour, determined to hunt out some weatherproof barn within easy distance of a river or the sea, where Legg and I could take our boys to camp at Easter. I left on a Monday, and I would have Canon Eldred, if he ever reads this, to note the date, because the dates are an important part of my narrative, and Legg came with me to the station, for I had several matters to arrange with him connected with the parish work. I took a 10 days ticket. It was stamped 22nd September, and as I said, the 22nd was a Monday. That night I slept at Dunsley. It was the end of the season. Nearly all the visitors had left the place, but the harbour was jammed with the herring fleet, storm-bound for over 3 days, and all the alleyways in the old town were crowded with fishermen. On the Tuesday I started off with my rucksack, intending to follow the line of the cliff, but the easterly gale was too much for me, and I struck inland onto the moors. I walked the whole of the day, a good 35 miles, and towards dusk got a lift in a farmer's cart. He was going to Chedsholm, and there I spent the night at the Ship Inn, a stone's throw from the Abbey church. I felt disinclined for a long tramp on Wednesday, so I walked on into Rapmore in the morning, left my things with old Mr. Robinson at the Crown, borrowed a rod and tackle from him, and spent the afternoon fishing the Lansdale Beck. I found a splendid camping ground, but no barn or building, and saw the farmer, a churchwarden who readily gave permission for the setting up of our tents, if ever we brought the boys that way. Wednesday night I spent at Rapmore, Thursday at Frankstone Edge, where I dined with the vicar, a college friend of Legg's, and Friday at Gorton. The landlady of the inn at Gorton kept a green parrot in a cage in the parlour. It was remarkably tame, and though I am not usually fond of such birds, I remember spending quite a long time talking to it in the evening. I set out on the morning of Saturday, prepared for a long walk and a probable soaking. Not that the rain was falling, but there was a mist sweeping inland over the moors from the sea, which I was obliged to face, since my track lay eastwards. I followed up the road to the end of the dale, and then took a rough path that skirted a plantation of firs past a disused quarry onto the moor. By noon I was right on the top of the tableland. I ate my sandwiches in the shelter of a peat shooting butt while I tried to find my exact position on the map. It was not altogether easy, but I made a rough approximation, and then looked to see which was the nearest village where I could find lodging for the night. Chedsholm, where I had slept on Tuesday, seemed to be the easiest of access, and though they had charged me just double of what was reasonable for supper, bed, and breakfast, the fare was good and the house quiet, and no small consideration on a Saturday night. It was after 2 when I left the shelter of the butt. I had at first some difficulty in finding my way. There were no landmarks on the moor to guide me. The flat expanse was only broken by mound after mound of unclothed shale, running in parallel lines from north to south, which marked the places where men had searched for ironstone many years before. Gradually the mounds grew less and less frequent, and I was beginning to think that I had left them all behind, when one, larger than the rest, loomed up out of the mist. Every man has experienced, at some point of his life, that strange intuition of danger, which compels us, if only it be strong enough, to alter some course of action, substituting for a reasonable motive the blind force of fear. I was walking straight towards the mound when I came to a standstill. Something seemed to repel me from the spot, while at the same time I became conscious of my intense isolation, alone on the moor, miles away from any fellow creature. I stopped for half a minute, half in doubt as to whether to proceed. And then I told myself that fear is always strongest when in pursuit, and, smiling at my folly, I went on. At the further side of the mound was the body of a dead man. He was a foreigner, with dark skin and long, oily locks of hair. A scarlet handkerchief was tied loosely round his throat. There were earrings in his ears. He lay on his back, with his eyes wide open and glazed. My first feeling was one not of surprise or pity, but of intense, overpowering nausea. Then, with an effort, I pulled myself together and examined the body more closely. I could see at once that he had been dead several days. The hands were white and cold, and the limbs strangely limp. His clothes were little more than rags. The shirt was torn open and tattooed on the chest. Even in my horror I could not help but marvel at the skill with which the thing was done, was a great green parrot with wings outstretched. At first I could see no sign of how the man had met his death. It was not until I turned the body over that I noticed an ugly wound at the back of the skull that might have been made by some blunt instrument or a stone. There was nothing for me to do except report the matter to the police as quickly as possible. The nearest constable would be stationed at Chedsholm, 10 miles away, and I decided that the best way of getting there in the mist would be to walk eastwards until I struck the mineral line that runs from the Bleedale ironstone quarries. This I did, and I shall not easily forget the joyful feeling of companionship in a living world that I experienced on hearing the distant whistle of an engine, and saw 5 minutes later through a break in the clouds the long train of trucks crawling along the skyline. Once on the permanent way, my progress became less slow. Freed from the necessity of maintaining a sense of direction, I began to think more of my horrible discovery. Who could the man be, and why had he been killed? He seemed to have nothing in common with this wild, cold country, a mariner whom one might have seen without surprise in the days of the Spanish Main, marooned with emptied treasure chests on some spit of dazzling, shadeless sand. And then, the man being killed, why had the murderer done nothing to hide the traces of his crime? What could have been easier than to have covered the body with the loose shale from the mound? I could have done the thing in 5 minutes, I said to myself, if only I had a trowel. But it was useless for me to wonder what might be the meaning of this illustration to a story I could never hope to read. I left the line at the point where it crossed the road, and then followed the latter down the ridge to Chedsholm. I must have been a mile or more from the village when the silence of the late afternoon was suddenly broken by the tolling of a bell. I remember once on Bob's Ketch being overtaken by a sea fog. The current was running strong, and Bob was a stranger to the coast. "It's all right, we shall worry through," he said, and had hardly finished speaking when we heard the wild, mad clanging of the bell-buoy. I did not soon forget the look of utter surprise on Bob's face. "There's some mistake," he said, with all his old lack of logic. "It's no earthly business to be there." That was how I felt on that September evening 2 years ago. What right had the church bell to be ringing? There would be no evening service on Saturday in a place the size of Chedsholm. It was too late in the day for a funeral. And yet, what else could it be? For, as I passed down the village street, I noticed that the windows of the shops were shuttered. There were men, too, hanging about the green, dressed in their Sunday black. I found the police station without difficulty, or rather the cottage where the constable lived. He was away, so his wife told me, but would be back in the morning, and as there seemed to be no way of communicating with the authorities, I was obliged, for the time being, to keep my secret to myself. The door of the Ship Inn was shut, and I had to knock twice before the landlady appeared. She recognised me at once. "Yes," she said, "we can put you up, to be sure. You can have the same room as before, number 3, to the right at the top of the stair. The girl's out, I'm afraid, so I can only give you a cold supper." 10 minutes later I was standing before a cheerful fire in the parlour, while Mrs. Shafto spread the cloth, dealing out to me in the meantime the gossip of the week. There were few visitors now. The season was too late, but she expected to have a houseful in a fortnight's time when Mr. Somerset from Steelborough was coming back with a party for another week's shooting. "It's a pity we only get people in the spring and summer," she said. "A village like this is terrible poor, and every visitor makes a difference. I suppose they find it too lonely, but bless my life, there's nothing to be afraid of on these moors. You could walk all day without meeting anybody. There's no one to harm you. Well, sir, there's your supper ready. If you want anything, you've only got to touch the bell." "How is it," I asked as I sat down, "that the place is so quiet tonight? I always thought that Saturday evenings were your busiest times." "So they are," said Mrs. Shafto. "We do very little business on a Sunday. It's only a 6 days' licence, you see. If you'll excuse me, sir, I think that's one of the children calling. I'm only single-handed just at present, for the girl's away at church." She left the room, seeing nothing of the effect that her words had on me. Sunday, I thought. What can she mean? Surely she must be mistaken. Yet there in front of me was the calendar. Sunday the 28th. Less than an hour before I had heard the church bell calling to evening prayer. The men whom I had seen lounging about the street were only the ordinary Sunday idlers. Somewhere, in the last week, I must have missed a day. But where? I pulled out my pocket diary. The space allotted to each day was filled with brief notes. First, I said to myself, let me make certain of a date from which to reckon. I was positive that I had started my holiday on Monday, the 22nd. For further information, there was the return half of my ticket stamped with the date. On Monday I slept at Dunsley, Tuesday at this same inn at Chedsholm, Wednesday at Rapmore, Thursday at Frankstone Edge, and Friday at Gorton. Each day, as I looked back, seemed well filled. My recollection of each was clearly defined. And yet somewhere there was a gap of 24 hours, about which I knew nothing. I have always been absent-minded, ludicrously so, my friends might say. It is, in fact, a trait in my character that has on more than one occasion put me into an embarrassing situation, but here was something of a nature completely different. In vain I groped about in my memory to search for even the shadow of an explanation. The week came back to me as no sequence of indistinguishable grey days, but the clearest of well-ordered processions. But was it really Sunday? Could the whole thing be a hoax, explicable as the result of some absurd wager? In default of a better, the hypothesis was worth testing. I made a pretence of finishing the meal, and taking my hat from the stand, hurried out of the house. I walked in the direction of the church, but as I approached the building my heart sank within me. I passed 6 young fellows hanging about the churchyard gate, waiting to walk back home with their girls. "It's been a dreary Sunday," I said, and one stopped in the act of lighting a cigarette to agree. I stood in the porch to listen. They were singing Bishop Ken's evening hymn. Then came the thin, piping voice of the priest, asking for defence against the perils and dangers of the night. Under a feeling of almost unbearable depression, I made my way back to the inn and its empty parlour. "After all," I said to myself, "there's nothing that I can do. Other men before now have lost their memory. I should be thankful for regaining it so quickly, and that no harm has been done. No good, at any rate, can result from my pondering over the thing." But in spite of my resolution, I found it impossible to control my thoughts. Again and again I found myself returning to the subject, fascinated by this sudden break in the past and the possibilities that sprang from it. Where had I been? What had I done? I believe that it was the sight of an ordinary cottage hospital collecting box on the mantelpiece that suggested to me a new way of approaching the problem. I have always kept accurate accounts, jotting down the expenses of each day, not in my diary, but in a separate pocket cash book. This, I thought, might throw new light on the matter. I took it out and hastily turned over the pages. At first sight it told me nothing. There was the same list of villages and their inns. No new names appeared. Then I read through again. This time I made a discovery. The amounts I had paid in bills for a night's lodging, for supper, bed, and breakfast, were much the same at all the inns, with the exception of the Ship at Chedsholm. The bill there seemed to be just twice as much as what it should have been. I only remembered to have spent one night there, Tuesday. It might be that I had spent Wednesday night as well. I rang the bell and ordered what I wanted for breakfast. Then, as Mrs. Shafto was leaving the room, I asked when it was that I had slept at the inn. "Tuesday and Wednesday," she said. "You left us on Thursday morning for Rapmore. Good night, sir. I'll see that you are called at 7:30. So my supposition was right. The day had been lost at Chedsholm. I wished, as soon as she had gone, that I had asked the woman more. She might have told me something of what I had done. And yet, how could I have asked such questions except in the most general terms, without arousing the suspicion that I was mad? From her behaviour it was evident that I had conducted myself in a normal fashion. Very likely I had been out all day walking, only to return to the inn at night dead tired. Why should I worry about this thing, so small compared to the tragedy that centred in my discovery of the afternoon? It was clear, however, that I should not find peace sitting by the fire in the parlour. The clock had struck 9:30. I took my candle from the sideboard and went upstairs to bed. My room was much the same as other rooms in country inns, but there was a hanging bookshelf in the corner holding 6 books. Dr. Meiklejohn's Sermons in Advent, Gulliver's Travels, Yorkshire Anecdotes, The House by the Sea, and 2 bound volumes, one of the boy's own paper and the other of some American magazine. The latter I took down, and, turning over the pages, saw that the type was good and that the stories were illustrated by some fine half-tone engravings. I got into bed and, placing the candle on the chair by my side, began to read. The story dealt with a young Methodist minister in a New England town. The girl he loved had promised herself in marriage to a sailor who had been washed ashore from a stranded brig bound for Baltimore from Smyrna. Maddened by the girl's love for the foreigner, he forged a letter arranging for a rendezvous on the sand dunes, met his rival there, and shot him through the heart. There was nothing remarkable about the story. I read it to the end unmoved. But on turning the last page over, I came across a full-page illustration that held me fascinated. It showed the scene on the dunes, the minister in his suit of black gazing down on the dead body of the Syrian sailor, just as I had stood that afternoon, and underneath were the words taken from the letterpress of the story. What would he not have given to blot out the sight from his memory? I suppose that up to the time of which I am writing, my life had been a very ordinary one, filled with ordinary weekday pleasures and cares, regulated by ordinary routine. Within the space of a few hours I had experienced two great emotional shocks, the sudden discovery of the body on the moor, and this inexplicable loss of memory. Each by itself had proved sufficiently disturbing, but I had at least looked upon them as unconnected. A mere chance had shown me that I might be mistaken. I had stood, as it were, on the watershed at the source of two rivers. I had assumed that they flowed into two oceans. The clouds lifted, and I saw that they joined each other to form a torrent of irresistible force that would inevitably overwhelm me. The whole thing seemed impossible, but I had a sickening feeling that the impossible was true, that I was the instrument, the unwitting tool in this ghastly tragedy. It was useless to lie in bed. I got up and paced the room. Again and again I tried to shut in the horrible thought behind a high wall of argument, built so carefully that there seemed to be no loophole for its escape. My best efforts were of no avail. I was seized with an overmastering fear of myself and the deed I might have done. I could think of only one thing to do, to report the whole matter to the police, to inform them of my inability to account for my doings on the Wednesday, and to welcome every investigation. Anything, I told myself, is better than this intolerable uncertainty. And yet it seemed a momentous step to take. Supposing that I had nothing to do with this man's death, but at the same time had been the last person seen with him, I might run the risk of being punished for another's crime. I owed something to the position I held, to my future career, and so, at last, dazed and weary, I lay down to wait for sleep. I did so with the firm determination that on the morrow I would retrace the path I had followed that afternoon. I might discover some fresh clue to the tragedy. I might find that the whole thing was but the fancy of an overwrought brain. Slowly I became aware of a narrowing of the field of consciousness. A warm, soft mist surrounded me and enfolded me. I heard the church clock strike the hour, but was too weary to count the strokes. The bell seemed to be tolling. Every note grew fainter, and I fell asleep. When I awoke, it was 9 o'clock. The sun was shining in through the window, and pulling up the blind, I saw a sky of cloudless blue. Sleep had brought hope. I dressed quickly, laughing at the night's fears. In certain moods, nothing is so strong as the force of unexpected coincidence. I told myself that I had been in a morbidly sensitive mood on the preceding evening, and in the clear light of day I took up the bound volume which had been the source of so much uneasiness. Really, there was nothing in the story of the Methodist minister and the sailor, and as to the illustration, I turned the last page over and found that the illustration did not exist. Evidently I had imagined the whole thing. "Another lovely day," said Mrs. Shafto as she brought in the breakfast. "Will you be out walking again, sir? If you like, I could put up some sandwiches for you." I thought the idea a good one, and telling her I should not be back until 4 or 5, set out soon after 11. For the first few miles I had no difficulty in retracing my steps, but after I crossed the mineral line there were no landmarks to guide me. More than once I asked myself why I went on. I could give no satisfactory reply. I think now it must have been the desire to be brought face to face with facts that impelled me. I had had enough of the unbridled fancies of the preceding evening, and longed to discover some clue to the mystery, however faint. At last I found myself among the old ironstone workings. There was the long line of mounds thrown up like ramparts, and there was the one standing alone in advance of the rest, beside which the body lay. Slowly I walked towards it. It seemed smaller in the light of a cloudless noon than in Sunday's mists. What was I to find? With beating heart I scrambled up the slope of shale. I stood on the top and looked around. There was nothing. Only the wide expanse of moor and sky. My first thought was that I had mistaken the place. Eagerly I scanned the ground for footprints. I found them almost immediately. They corresponded exactly to my nailed walking boots. Evidently the place was the same. Then what had happened? There was but one explanation possible, that I had imagined the whole thing. And, strange as it may seem, I accepted the explanation gladly, for it was the cold reality that I dreaded, linked as it had been with the awful idea that I had done the deed myself in a fit of unconscious frenzy. And in my thankfulness I knelt down on the heather and praised the God of the blue sky and sunlight for having saved me from the terrors of the night. With a mind at peace with itself, I walked back across the moor. I determined to end my holiday on the morrow, to consult some nerve specialist, and, if need be, to go abroad for a month or two. I dined that night at the Ship Inn with a talkative old gentleman who succeeded in keeping me from thinking of my own affairs, and, feeling sure of sleep, went early to bed. My story does not end there. I wish that it did, but, as Canon Eldred said in yesterday's sermon, it is often our duty to accept things as they are, not to waste the limited amount of energy that is given for the day's work in vain regret or morbid anticipation. For, as I was sitting at breakfast on the morrow, I heard a man in the bar ask Mrs. Shafto for the morning's paper. She told him that the gentleman in the parlour was reading it, but that Tuesday's was in the kitchen. Tuesdays? I said to myself. Mondays, she means. Today's Tuesday. And I looked at the calendar on the mantelpiece. The calendar said Wednesday. I looked at the newspaper and saw on every page Wednesday, 1st October. I got up half-dazed and walked into the bar. I suppose Mrs. Shafto must have seen that there was something wrong, for before I spoke she offered me a glass of brandy. "I'm losing my memory," I said. "I think I can't be quite well. I can't remember anything I did yesterday." "Why, bless you, sir," she said. "You were out on the moors all day. I made you some sandwiches, and in the evening you were talking to the old gentleman who left this morning on free trade and protection." "Then what did I do on Monday? I thought that was Monday." "Oh, Monday," said Mrs. Shafto. "You were out on the moors all that day, too. Don't you recollect borrowing my trowel? There was something you wanted to bury. A green parrot, I think you said it was. I remember because it seemed so strange. You came in quite late in the evening and looked regular knocked up, just the same as last week. It's my belief, sir, that you've been walking too far." I asked for my account, and while she was making it out, I went upstairs to my bedroom. I took down the bound volume from the shelf and turned to the story of the Methodist minister. The illustration at the end was certainly not there, but on close inspection I found that a page was missing. For some reason it had been carefully removed. I turned to the index of illustrations and saw that the picture with the words beneath that had so strangely affected me should have been found on the missing page. I walked to the nearest station and took the train to Steelborough, where I told my story to an inspector of police, who evidently disbelieved it. But in the course of a day or two they made discoveries. The body of an unknown sailor, a foreigner with curiously distinctive tattooings on the breast, was found in the place I described. For some time there was nothing to connect me with the crime. Then a gamekeeper came forward, who said that on Wednesday, the 24th, he had seen 2 men, one of whom seemed to be a clergyman, the other a tramp, walking across the moor. He had called to them, but they had not stopped. I stood my trial. I was examined, of course, by alienists, and here I am. No, Canon Eldred, the world is a little more complicated than you think. I agree with you as to the necessity for cheerfulness, but I want better reasons than yours. These are mine. They may only be a poor lunatic's, but they are none the worse for that. The world, I consider, is governed by God through a hierarchy of spirits. Little Charlie Lovell, by the way, says that he saw the Archangel Gabriel yesterday evening as he was coming from the bathroom, and for all I know, he may be right. It is governed by a hierarchy of spirits, some greater and more wise than others, and to each is given its appointed task. I suppose that for some reason, which I may never know, it was necessary for that sailor-man to die. It may have been necessary for his salvation that he should die in a certain way, that his soul at the last might be purged by sudden terror. I cannot say, for I was only the tool. The great and powerful, but not all-powerful, spirit did his work as far as concerned the sailor, and then, with a workman's love for his tool, he thought of me. It was not needful that I should remember what I had done. I had been lent by God, as Gog was lent to Satan. But, my work finished, this spirit in his pity took from me all memory of my deed. But, as I said before, he was not omnipotent, and I suppose the longing of the brute in me to see again his handiwork guided me unconsciously to the bank of shale on the moor, though even at the last minute I had felt something urge me not to go on. That and the chance reading of an idle magazine story had been my undoing. And when for the second time I lost my memory, and some power outside myself took control in order to cover up the traces before I revisited the scene, the issue of events had passed into other hands. Sometimes I find myself wondering who that sailor was, and what his life had been. Nobody knows.